Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Futurism. Futurism was a short-lived movement in the early 20th century that only lasted about a decade at the most, but was incredibly influential both in Russia and in the West. Futurism is generally considered to have originated in Italy, although, as we will see, Russia's Futurist movement was also somewhat homegrown. But in any case, Futurism, as we know it in the West, arose in Italy around 1910, and it rejected the past, as you might guess from its name. It was forward-looking, it looked to the future. It rejected the past, and it emphasized or even glorified youth, speed, violence, and machines. It was very much a movement of the future, and it loved bicycles. So the picture on the left is actually supposed to be of someone on a bicycle. It loved bicycles, it loved trains, steamships, and particularly airplanes, which were the incredible new invention of the 1910s. And as I mentioned, it was short-lived. It really only lasted about 4 or 5 years in Italy, but was extremely influential, ended up influencing culture around the world. And Futurism also arose in Russia, where it became an extremely important movement in Russia at about the same time. While Russian Futurism eventually took on the Italian name of Futurism, and shared many things in common with Italian Futurism, and was clearly influenced by Italian Futurism, the founders of Russian Futurism emphasized its status as a homegrown movement. So at around the same time that Futurismo was being created in Italy, some writers in Russia, particularly Vladimir Khlebnikov, whose picture you see there on the left, and the impresario David Burluk, broke with the symbolists and the acmeists. Khlebnikov was originally part of the symbolist circle and then part of the acmeist circle, but neither of those groups would publish him because his poetry was just too crazy. And so in 1910, he and David Burluk broke with them and created a group called Budytlyania, which means something like Citizens of the Future. And the Budytlyania published highly experimental poetry. If you read it, it's all full of sound experiments and messing around with sound symbolism and writing things that don't necessarily make any kind of rational sense. So they experimented with all kinds of poetic forms and making sounds. And they also experimented with the graphic layout of poetry on the page and things such as not using yat, the letter that was removed from the alphabet following the revolution. So prior to the revolution, they were already experimenting with not printing yat and also with leaving hard signs off the ends of words. In pre-revolutionary writing, any word that ended in a hard consonant had to end in a hard sign. And one of the major reforms to the orthography that happened after the Bolshevik Revolution was removing all of these hard signs at the ends of hard masculine words and removing yats from the alphabet and just writing yeah instead of writing yats. And so the Budytlyania were already doing this prior to the revolution, and so they must have in some way influenced the decision to change the orthography like this after the revolution. The Budytlyania were a fairly small group, but by 1912 they had expanded and changed their names and called themselves the Cubo Futurists. And they said that they were combining Italian Futurism with French Cubism. They called themselves the Cubo Futurists to distinguish themselves from the Ego Futurists, a different and St. Petersburg-based group. The Cubo Futurists were a Moscow-based group. So if you remember in the discussion of acmeism, I mentioned that acmeism was a very St. Petersburg-based movement. Futurism was a very Moscow-based movement because the Cubo Futurists were the most influential futurists. And so you can think about that difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg when you compare acmeism and futurism and how St. Petersburg is associated with good taste, elegance, classical style, and Western art, and how Moscow is associated with sort of liveliness, anarchy, traditional Russianness, and a emphasis on sort of brightness and color and energy over clean lines and classical style. So this Moscow-based group of Cubo Futurists included Khlebnikov, Burlyuk, another poet called Kruchonich, and of course Vladimir Mayakovsky, whom we'll discuss in more detail later. In 1912, they issued a poetry collection with a manifesto attached to it called A Slap in the Face of Public Taste, or Pashotchina Obsheственному Vkusu. And this included a lot of futurist poetry. It was where Mayakovsky was first published. And in the actual manifesto at the beginning, they called on readers and writers to throw Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and others off the steamship of modernity. They rejected everything that was old, including rejecting all of the old classical or beloved literature. They wanted to create something completely new. They wanted to create a new style of literature, a new style of art, and they wanted to create new words and a new language. And some of them did, in fact, create a new language, specifically Vladimir Khlebnikov and Alexei Kruchonich, who were sort of the intellectual leaders of the Cubo Futurist movement, experimented with writing in a language known as Zaum. Zaum is often translated into English as trans-sense or trans-reason. Za meaning behind or beyond, and meaning sense or reason or intellect. And so this Zaum language, or Zaumny Yazik, is supposed to break free with the restrictions of language and language as it existed at the time. It was supposed to render language opaque so that instead of looking at a word and immediately sensing the meaning from it and not paying attention to the word itself as its own object, the reader or the listener was supposed to see or hear the word and have to stop at that moment and deal with the word as a thing and try to parse the meaning out of it. So it was supposed to take your native language and turn it into a foreign language, basically. It was also supposed to allow for freer, fuller, less restricted expression that Khlebnikov and Kruchonich felt that language as it existed at the time was very restrictive, and they wanted to break free of those restrictions. They also wanted to return to a sort of an original Slavic language. There was a certain amount of Slavophilia or Pan-Slavism in their ideology about this. They wanted to create a Slavic language that was a pure and original Slavic language. So, for example, in their word Budytlyania, citizens of the future, they used the Slavic root budu or budyt instead of the foreign root futur, as in futurismo or futuristi. And so they did that with lots of words, with all words, basically. And their biggest and most impressive production in this form was an opera called Victory Over the Sun, Победа над солнцем, which was written entirely in Zaum. Kruchonich wrote the libretto and Khlebnikov wrote the introduction, and it was staged in 1913 as a completely Zaum and futurist production. If you read it, I'm not necessarily going to say that you should read it, although it's extremely interesting, but it's very challenging. So it really does force you to read your native language. If Russian is your native language, it forces you to read Russian as if it's not Russian and you're parsing through it word by word. So it's very fascinating. There's also a reason why we don't have a huge number of Zaum written texts. And there's a reason why there were a couple that were considered interesting, and then we don't really use it that much. It's very challenging to deal with. So while Khlebnikov and Kruchonich were the two main sort of intellectual and ideological leaders of the Cubo Futurists and the Futurist movement in Russia, there were also a number of other people who were associated with it who then went on to actually achieve more long-lasting and widespread fame and success. One of them was Kazimir Malevich. And you may or may not have heard of Malevich, but you have seen Malevich's influence all around you. Malevich made the set design for Победа над солнцем, Victory over the Sun, and he was already experimenting with geometric and abstract design. And during the performance of Victory over the Sun, which was done at a big fair in 1913, he painted what was to become his most influential, most shocking piece, which is Black Square. You can see it there on the left on the slide. And as you can see, Black Square is a black square on a white piece of canvas. And then he debuted it as a piece in 1915, where it caused a sensation. This was the same time that he created the Suprematist Movement. And the Suprematist Movement, or Suprematism, was a movement in the visual arts based on and related to Futurism that focused on geometric shapes. Instead of creating realistic depictions of the world around you, Suprematist artists created these geometric shapes, most notably Malevich's Black Square and Red Square, but also stuff that we would immediately recognize as contemporary abstract art. So he ended up basically founding the worldwide contemporary movement of abstract art. And so, like I said, while you may or may not have heard of Malevich, you have certainly seen lots of abstract art, and we still are producing this geometric contemporary abstract art that is based on this artistic style that he himself created. He would also paint things that were not completely abstract. So, for example, the image on the first slide of this lecture is one of his pieces called Red Cavalry. And as you can see, it has what are recognizably red horses galloping along the horizon. So it's not completely abstract. Nonetheless, you can see its bold primary colors and its use of geometric shapes, very much representative of suprematism and his geometric abstract art. Like the other movements of this period, Futurism was pretty short-lasting. It only lasted maybe half a decade to a decade in both Italy and Russia, but it was incredibly influential. You can see its influence both in specific artistic styles and in sort of the general cultural milieu and sort of general ideology of the period. It's hard to say whether Futurism was influencing the ideology of the period or the ideology of the period was influencing Futurism, but these ideas of throwing away the past, idolizing youth and machinery and violence, you can see them very strongly in the political movements that arose in the late teens and then the 20s and 30s all over Europe. So very much so in the Bolshevik Revolution and in the early Soviet period, or even the late Soviet period, this worship of machines and technology, of speed, of youth, of looking to the future, a high tolerance or even idealization of violence and a willingness to use violence to achieve one's aims. All of these are elements of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union. You can probably also see it in the totalitarian regimes that arose in Italy and Germany in the 20s and 30s. So again, it's hard to say, was Futurism influencing the ideology of the time, or was the ideology of the time influencing Futurism? But Futurism was very much of its time and very closely intertwined with the politics of its time. As I mentioned, we have things like this abstract art that was created by Malevich and others that spread all over the West and are still highly influential. We still create and consume lots of abstract art. In Russia, in particular, Futurism was very influential in the kind of artistic literary style, in the general approach to art in the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union rejected many aspects of futurism, especially with the adoption of socialist realism in 1934. But because one of the most influential and important poets for the Soviet period was Vladimir Mayakovsky, you can see him, he's there in the center of that picture of people who contributed to a slap in the face of public taste. Because Vladimir Mayakovsky was this towering figure in Russian literature in the 20th century, and specifically in Soviet literature, even as they rejected many things about the Futurist program, the Soviets continued to be influenced in many ways by this Futurist style. And so you can sort of get by in discussing the 20th century, perhaps without knowing too much about symbolism or acmeism, but I don't think that you can understand any aspect of the 20th century at all without understanding futurism.